Trash like you has no business touching this piano. Principal Morrison's words hit like a slap as Amara Washington approached the instrument. His polished shoe kicked the bench aside. His hand slammed the piano lid shut. 200 people watched. Most expected failure. Some hoped for it. Amara's worn sneakers stopped at the scattered sheet music. Her second-hand dress shook as every eye burned into her. Morrison's smile widened as whispers spread like wildfire. "Did you really think we'd let some ghetto girl embarrass this school?" he sneered. But something shifted in Amara's eyes. Her grandmother's words echoed, "Let your gift speak louder than their hate." Her trembling hands steadied, her spine straightened. Morrison had no idea what he'd just unleashed. What happened next would destroy every assumption about talent, worth, and the power of music to transform 17 years of pain into 17 minutes of pure magic. Have you ever been told you don't belong somewhere, only to discover that's exactly where you were meant to shine? 3 hours earlier, Amara Washington had woken to the familiar sound of her grandmother's oxygen machine whirring in the next room. The thin walls of their cramped Detroit apartment did nothing to muffle the rhythmic mechanical breathing that had become the soundtrack to their lives. She rolled off the pull-out couch that served as her bed, careful not to disturb the stack of sheet music balanced on the armrest. Chopin's Ballade number. One stared back at her, every note memorized but never properly played. The pages were worn soft from handling, edges yellow with age. The kitchen barely fit 2 people. Amara moved quietly around her grandmother, spooning oatmeal into chipped bowls. Sunlight struggled through windows that hadn't been cleaned in months, casting dusty rays across linoleum that had seen better decades. "Are you practicing today, baby?" Grandma Rose wheezed, her voice paper-thin but warm. "The community center opens at noon." Amara kissed the old woman's forehead. "Mrs. Carter said I could use the piano until 3. Rose nodded, pride flickering in tired eyes. "Your mama would be so proud. She always knew you had the gift. The gift. That's what they called it when Amara's small fingers first found melodies on the toy keyboard from Goodwill. What they called it when she taught herself to read music from library books. What they still called it even though the gift had never put food on the table or paid for Rose's medication. Amara checked the time. 2 hours before her shift at Miller's Corner Store. Just enough time to shower and grab her backpack, the same one she'd carried since freshman year, held together with duct tape and determination. Riverside High School rose from the Detroit streets like a concrete monument to broken promises. Paint peeled from its walls in long strips, revealing rust stains that looked like tears. The main entrance doors hung crooked on their hinges, and half the windows were covered with plywood instead of glass. Students shuffled through metal detectors each morning, their conversations echoing off cracked tile floors. The smell of industrial disinfectant mixed with cafeteria grease and something else, something that might have been hope, slowly dying. Amara's locker was stuck as always. She yanked it open, revealing a space she'd transformed into a small shrine to her dreams. Photos of Carnegie Hall and Lincoln Center were taped to the metal walls. A program from the Detroit Symphony Orchestra, picked up from the lobby floor after a free community concert. And there, in a plastic folder held together with tape, her compositions. She wrote music in the margins of textbooks when teachers droned on about subjects that felt pointless. While her classmates passed notes about parties and relationships, Amara scribbled melodies that captured the sound of her grandmother's labored breathing, the rhythm of rain on their leaky roof, the harmony she heard in her mother's lullabies from memory. "Still dreaming, Washington?" Amara turned to find Jessica Martinez, arms crossed, designer backpack slung over her shoulder. Jessica's father owned 3 restaurants in the suburbs. Her problems were different problems. "Some of us have to," Amara replied, closing her locker. "My dad says dreaming doesn't pay bills." Jessica's voice held no malice, just the exhausted wisdom of someone who'd learned too young that the world had rules. "Says kids like us gotta be realistic. Kids like us." The phrase followed Amara down hallways lined with motivational posters about reaching for stars. Easy words when you weren't stretching every dollar, when your biggest worry wasn't whether Grandma's oxygen concentrator would last another month. In advanced placement music theory, Amara sat in the back row as always. Mrs. Henderson taught with the enthusiasm of someone slowly accepting defeat. Half the instruments were broken, the other half missing pieces. The piano in the corner had keys that stuck and strings that had given up their pitch long ago. "Today we'll study classical composition," Mrs. Henderson announced to her class of 12. "Can anyone name a famous piece by Chopin?" Amara's hand shot up before she could stop herself. The other students turned, some rolling their eyes. Smart girl, scholarship kid, always eager to show what she knew. "Ballade number 1 in G minor," she said quietly. "Excellent. Can you tell us about its structure?" For the next 10 minutes, Amara described the piece with technical precision and emotional understanding that made Mrs. Henderson's eyes widen. She talked about the way Chopin wove themes together, how the melody carried pain and hope in equal measure, how the final section demanded everything a pianist had to give. When she finished, silence filled the room. Have you played it?" Mrs. Henderson asked. "Only in my head." Amara's voice was barely a whisper. "And on my keyboard at home. But most of the keys don't work anymore." Mrs. Henderson opened her mouth to respond, but the bell rang. Students filed out, chattering about lunch plans and weekend parties. Amara gathered her books, slipping the Chopin score between her algebra homework. At Miller's corner store, she restocked shelves and swept floors while humming Chopin under her breath. Mr. Miller, a kind man with patient eyes, let her practice fingering on the counter when no customers were around. "You sound different when you hum that fancy music," he observed, counting the register. "Peaceful." "Music makes sense," Amara said, wiping down the windows. "Everything else is just noise." By evening, she was home again, heating leftover soup for dinner. Rose sat propped up in her recliner, watching game shows with the volume too loud. Medical bills covered the coffee table like fallen leaves, each one a reminder of how much they owed, how little they had. "Baby?" Rose's voice cut through the television noise. "Yes, Grandma." "Tomorrow's that school showcase, right?" Amara's hands stilled on the soup ladle. "Yes, ma'am." "You gonna play?" The question hung in the air between them. They both knew the answer. They both knew why it mattered. The scholarship audition was 3 weeks away. Amara's only shot at a real music education. Her only chance to transform the gift into something that could change their lives. "I don't know," Amara whispered. Rose struggled to sit up straighter, her breathing labored but her voice firm. "Baby, sometimes you have to let your gift speak louder than their hate. Your mama always said that. Said the world is going to try to make you small, but your music can make you giant." That night, Amara lay on the pull-out couch listening to her grandmother's oxygen machine and the distant sound of sirens. She held the Chopin score against her chest, feeling the weight of 17 years of dreams pressed between those worn pages. Tomorrow, she would have to choose between safety and possibility, between silence and the risk of being heard. Principal Richard Morrison arrived at Riverside High each morning in his spotless silver BMW, parking in the space marked "Reserved for Excellence." The license plate read, "Achieve One," a reminder to everyone that success could be measured, displayed, owned. He stepped from the car in his pressed navy suit, Italian leather briefcase in hand. The contrast was deliberate. While students trudged through metal detectors in second-hand clothes, Morrison glided past in fabric that cost more than most families spent on groceries in a month. His office occupied the school's prime real estate, corner windows offering views of the Detroit skyline, walls lined with awards and photographs. Morrison shaking hands with senators, Morrison cutting ribbons at suburban school openings, Morrison accepting recognition from the Excellence in Urban Education Foundation. The centerpiece was his mahogany desk, spotless except for a single nameplate that read, Principal Richard Morrison, M.E.D., bringing excellence to every corner. Behind it hung his degrees from prestigious universities, each one matted and framed with precision. Morrison had spent 15 years climbing the educational ladder. First as a teacher in comfortable suburban districts, then as an assistant principal, where parents drove luxury cars and students took piano lessons for granted. Riverside High was supposed to be a stepping stone, 2 years of urban experience to round out his resume before moving to a district that matched his ambitions. But 2 years had become 15, and Morrison had learned to find satisfaction in being the biggest fish in a small, struggling pond. His morning routine never varied. Coffee from the expensive machine in his private break area, never the burnt sludge from the teacher's lounge. A review of test scores, attendance reports, disciplinary actions. Then he walked through the hallways, observing his domain. Morrison moved through the school like a general inspecting troops. Students stepped aside when they saw him coming, conversations dying mid-sentence. Teachers straightened their postures, suddenly remembering lesson plans they hoped he wouldn't question. Excellence requires standards, he often told new staff. Standards require boundaries. Some students will rise to meet them. Others. He would pause, letting the implication hang. Others need to understand their limitations. His inner circle reflected his philosophy perfectly. Vice Principal Janet Walsh, a nervous woman who agreed with everything Morrison said before he finished saying it. Department heads who'd learned that questioning his vision was career suicide. And the Parent Booster Club, 3 wealthy families whose children attended Riverside through open enrollment, bringing their suburban dollars and expectations with them. We can't lower the bar just because some students can't reach it, Morrison explained to them during monthly meetings. That's not compassion. That's enabling mediocrity. The parents nodded, writing checks for new computers in the advanced classes, while the general population made do with textbooks held together with tape. Morrison reserved his deepest disdain for what he called misplaced artistic ambitions. The drama club reduced to performing in the cafeteria because the auditorium was deemed too expensive to maintain. The art program cut to 1 part-time teacher who brought her own supplies. And the music department, where Mrs. Henderson struggled with broken instruments and shrinking enrollment. These children need practical skills, Morrison told the school board. Job training. Basic literacy. We can't waste resources on creative pursuits that won't serve them in the real world. Yet he'd preserved the showcase tradition, not out of support for the arts, but because it served his purposes. The annual Excellence Showcase drew local media attention, featuring carefully selected performances that reflected well on the school's image. Morrison handpicked the participants, ensuring a safe display of acceptable talents. This year's showcase was particularly important. The district superintendent would attend, evaluating Morrison's performance as he angled for a promotion to central administration. A smooth, controlled event would demonstrate his leadership capabilities. But Morrison had noticed disruptions to his carefully ordered world. Students lingering near the music room during lunch, whispered conversations about someone who could really play. And yesterday, Mrs. Henderson had mentioned a student request for showcase participation, a request he'd immediately dismissed. Amara Washington? Morrison had scoffed. The girl from the projects? Janet, we've discussed this. We can't have those students embarrassing themselves and the school. It's not kind to give them false hope. Janet Walsh nodded quickly. Of course, Mr. Morrison. I'll speak to Mrs. Henderson. But rumors traveled faster than administrative memos. Morrison heard fragments, whispers about Chopin, about technical mastery, about a performance that could challenge assumptions. He dismissed them as typical teenage exaggeration, but a small irritation gnawed at him. The showcase would proceed as planned. Safe performances, appropriate students, controlled outcomes. Morrison would deliver his opening remarks about excellence and standards. Parents would applaud politely, and his path to promotion would remain clear. He had no idea that 17-year-old Amara Washington was about to walk into his perfectly ordered world and change everything he thought he controlled. The showcase was just hours away, and Morrison's confidence had never been higher. The auditorium buzzed with forced energy as families filed into creaky seats that had seen better decades. Parents clutched programs printed on cheap paper, students shifted nervously backstage, and faculty members arranged themselves in the front row like a judicial panel. Principal Morrison stood at the podium, surveying his kingdom. 237 people had gathered for the Excellence Showcase, the largest turnout in 5 years. Local news reporter Sarah Carter sat in the third row, her cameraman adjusting lighting for what they hoped would be an uplifting community story. In the back corner, almost invisible among the crowd, sat Rose Washington in her wheelchair. The oxygen tank beside her chair drew curious glances, but her eyes remained fixed on the stage where her granddaughter might, or might not, get her chance. Morrison tapped the microphone, his voice carrying that particular tone of authority mixed with benevolence. Welcome, families, to Riverside High's annual celebration of achievement. Tonight, you'll witness the results of hard work, dedication, and appropriate expectations. The first performances unfolded exactly as planned. Safe piano pieces played by students whose parents could afford lessons. A violin solo that stayed within comfortable boundaries. A poetry reading about following dreams, generic enough to offend no one, inspire few. After each performance, Morrison returned to the microphone with measured praise. Excellent technique. Wonderful preparation. A perfect example of what dedication can achieve. But something was building in the audience, a restless energy that suggested people wanted more than careful competence. Conversations buzzed during transitions. Eyes wandered toward the wings where other students waited. Morrison sensed the shift and decided to regain control with an announcement that would demonstrate his fairness while maintaining order. This year, he said, his smile broadening, we're offering something special. An open invitation for any student who believes they possess exceptional talent to demonstrate their abilities. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Mrs. Henderson shifted uncomfortably in her seat, recognizing the trap being set. Of course, Morrison continued, we expect only serious demonstrations of skill. This is not amateur hour. This is a showcase of genuine excellence. His eyes scanned the audience, landing briefly on the back corner where Rose Washington sat with her oxygen tank. His smile tightened almost imperceptibly. So, he announced with theatrical generosity, who among our students has the courage to accept this challenge? The silence stretched uncomfortably. Students backstage exchanged glances, suddenly aware that Morrison's invitation felt more like a dare designed to expose overconfidence. Then, from the back of the auditorium, a figure began moving down the aisle. Amara Washington walked steadily toward the stage, her second-hand dress catching under the harsh stage lights. Each step echoed in the growing silence as 200 pairs of eyes tracked her movement. Morrison's expression shifted from surprise to something approaching amusement. He'd heard the whispers, dismissed the rumors, but here was an opportunity too perfect to waste. Ah, Miss Washington, he said into the microphone, his voice carrying to every corner of the auditorium. I understand you consider yourself quite the musician. Amara reached the stage steps but didn't climb them yet. She looked up at Morrison, her voice clear but quiet. I'd like to play something, if that's acceptable. The formality of her response caught Morrison off guard for a moment, but he recovered quickly. Of course, of course. We're always eager to discover hidden talents. The way he said hidden made several audience members shift uncomfortably. But Morrison was just getting started. Tell us, Miss Washington, What piece have you prepared? Something from your musical background? The pause before musical background carried enough weight to make the racial undertones unmistakable. In the front row, Mrs. Henderson closed her eyes briefly, recognizing the cruelty unfolding. Chopin's Ballade number. 1 in G minor, Amara replied. A ripple of surprise moved through the crowd. Even Morrison's confident expression flickered. He knew enough about classical music to recognize the technical demands of that particular piece. Chopin, he repeated slowly. That's quite ambitious. Are you certain you wouldn't prefer something more suited to your experience? But Amara was already climbing the steps. Each movement is deliberate, unhurried. She reached the piano and stood beside it, waiting. Morrison realized he'd reached a crossroads. He could end this now, make some excuse about time constraints or appropriateness. But the audience was watching, the news camera was recording, and his reputation for fairness was at stake. More importantly, his certainty that she would fail made the risk seem manageable. Let her embarrass herself publicly. Let everyone see what happened when students reached beyond their capabilities. The lesson would be worth the brief awkwardness. Very well, Morrison announced, his voice regaining its confidence. Ladies and gentlemen, Miss Amara Washington will attempt Chopin's Ballade number. 1 inch. The word attempt hung in the air like a challenge, or a prediction of failure. Amara approached the piano bench as the auditorium held its collective breath, waiting to see whether the next few minutes would end in triumph or disaster. Amara stood beside the piano bench, her fingers hovering inches from the keys she'd dreamed of touching. The auditorium's silence pressed against her like a physical weight. 237 people were waiting. Watching. Some hoped she'd succeed. Others were certain she'd fail. Morrison's voice echoed in her mind. Attempting Chopin's Ballade number. 1 inch. The word attempt stung worse than any direct insult. It assumed failure before she'd played a single note. Her hands trembled slightly as memories flooded back. Her mother's voice singing lullabies in the small apartment that smelled of vanilla candles and hope. Her father's strong hands guided her tiny fingers across toy piano keys, showing her how melodies could carry emotions too big for words. Music is the language of the soul, baby girl, he'd whispered the night before the accident. When words fail, let the music speak. They'd been gone for 10 years now, but their voices lived in every note she'd ever played on that broken keyboard at home. In every melody she'd hummed while stocking shelves, in every composition she'd written in textbook margins during classes that felt meaningless. Amara glanced toward the back of the auditorium where her grandmother sat with the oxygen tank. Rose's eyes met hers across the distance, and the old woman's lips moved silently. Let your gift speak louder than their hate. The phrase her grandmother had repeated countless times. The words that had carried Amara through nights when the electricity was shut off, when there wasn't enough food, when the weight of being poor and black and forgotten felt too heavy to bear. But standing here now, Amara realized something had shifted. This wasn't about proving Morrison wrong or silencing the whispers. This wasn't even about the scholarship that could change her life. This was about honoring every person who'd been told they didn't belong. Every dreamer dismissed before they could even try. Every voice is silenced by assumptions about worth and capability. Her trembling stopped. Her spine straightened with quiet steel. Morrison had given her a platform, thinking it would be her downfall. But platforms could work both ways. They could elevate truth just as easily as they could expose failure. Amara adjusted the piano bench with professional precision, testing its height. Her movements were calm now, deliberate. She placed her hands above the keys, feeling the familiar weight of possibility. The auditorium held its breath. Principal Morrison, she said, her voice carrying clearly through the microphone. I'd be honored to share what music has taught me about excellence. She settled onto the bench, positioned her fingers, and closed her eyes for one heartbeat. When she opened them, something had changed in her expression. The scared teenager was gone. In her place sat a musician ready to speak the only language that had ever truly mattered. The first note was moments away. The first note emerged from the piano like a whispered secret. Soft, tentative, almost fragile. Amara's right hand found the opening melody of Chopin's ballad number, one while her left hand provided gentle accompaniment. The sound floated through the auditorium's stale air, transforming it into something sacred. Her fingers trembled slightly against the keys. The weight of 200 pairs of eyes pressed against her shoulders. Morrison's smirk from the podium burned in her peripheral vision. But as the melody began to unfold, something shifted inside her chest. The trembling slowed, then stopped. In the front row, Mrs. Henderson's eyes widened. She knew this piece, had studied it in conservatory 20 years ago before life and budget cuts reduced her dreams to teaching scales to disinterested teenagers. The opening required absolute control, perfect touch. Too heavy, and it became clumsy. Too light, and it disappeared. Amara had found the exact balance on her first attempt. Morrison shifted uncomfortably at the podium. The first 30 seconds revealed technical competence he hadn't expected from someone who'd learned piano on broken keyboards. But competence wasn't mastery. He crossed his arms, waiting for the inevitable breakdown when the piece's demands exceeded her abilities. His confidence remained intact, even as unease began creeping through his certainty. The melody line gained strength with each passing measure. Amara's touch grew more assured, her posture straightening as muscle memory took control. She'd played this piece thousands of times in her mind, her fingers moving across imaginary keys while she swept floors at Miller's corner store. Now, with real strings vibrating beneath her touch, the music came alive in ways she'd only dreamed. Students in the back rows stopped whispering. Parents checking their phones slowly lowered their devices. Something was happening that demanded attention, though many couldn't yet identify what made this performance different from the careful competence they'd witnessed earlier. The music entered its first development section, where Chopin wove the main theme through increasingly complex variations. Amara's left hand began its intricate dance across the lower registers while her right hand spun melodic gold in the treble. Her body started moving with the music. Not theatrical performance gestures, but the natural response of someone channeling something greater than technique. "Jesus," whispered a parent in the fourth row. "She's really playing that thing." His wife elbowed him quiet, but her own eyes had grown wide with recognition. She'd taken piano lessons as a child, knew enough to understand that what they were witnessing required years of serious training. Where had this girl learned to play like this? Morrison's confident expression began developing hairline cracks. This wasn't the embarrassing failure he'd orchestrated to teach lessons about knowing one's place. This was something else entirely, something that made his carefully controlled showcase feel suddenly small and artificial by comparison. Behind him, Mrs. Henderson gripped her program until it crumpled in her hands. She recognized not just technical skill, but musical intelligence that couldn't be taught. Amara understood the architecture of Chopin's composition, the way each section built toward the next, how the themes developed and transformed. This wasn't memorization. This was interpretation at the highest level. The piece moved into its stormy middle section, where Chopin's genius demanded everything a pianist possessed. Rapid scales cascaded like waterfalls through treacherous key changes. Complex harmonies shifted like tectonic plates beneath the melody line. Lesser pianists broke here, their technique crumbling under pressure, their interpretations becoming mechanical survival exercises. Amara's hands flew across the keys with supernatural accuracy. Every note crystal clear, every rhythm precise as clockwork. But more than technical mastery, she brought emotional intelligence to each phrase that transformed notes into language. The storm in the music wasn't just marks on a page. It was every night she'd fallen asleep to her grandmother's labored breathing. Every morning she'd woken knowing bills would come that couldn't be paid. Every day she'd walked through school halls where dreams were luxuries she couldn't afford. The pain poured through her fingers into Chopin's notes, transforming personal struggle into universal language that spoke to every heart in the auditorium. Jessica Martinez, who'd mocked Amara's dreams that morning, found tears streaming down her face without understanding why. The music spoke to something buried beneath her learned cynicism, the part of her that still believed beautiful things were possible, that talent could transcend circumstances, that hope wasn't always naive. 3 rows behind her, Marcus Johnson, star football player who'd never voluntarily listened to classical music, felt his chest tighten with emotions he couldn't name. The intensity in Amara's performance reminded him of the focus he brought to the game, the total commitment required to achieve something extraordinary. In the back corner, Rose Washington clutched her oxygen mask with shaking hands, watching her granddaughter transform 17 years of pain into 17 minutes of pure transcendence. Every sacrifice, every unpaid bill, every night they'd chosen between heat and electricity, all of it was being justified in real time through the language of music. The piece reached its quiet interlude, where Chopin provided brief respite before the final storm. Amara's touch became gossamer light, each note floating like a prayer across water. The melody lines sang with such vulnerability that the entire auditorium leaned forward unconsciously, afraid to breathe too loudly and disturb the spell she was weaving. This was the section that separated true artists from technical players. Here, in the quiet moments, a pianist's soul became visible. Amara's soul proved to be vast and deep, filled with beauty that poverty and prejudice had somehow failed to destroy. Morrison found himself genuinely listening for the first time all evening. Despite his prejudices, despite his carefully constructed assumptions about talent and worth, he couldn't deny what his ears were telling him. This wasn't just good. This was extraordinary. This was the kind of performance that belonged in concert halls, not high school auditoriums. His throat tightened with an emotion he didn't want to examine. For 15 years, he'd convinced himself that maintaining low expectations was kindness, that protecting students from disappointment was wisdom. But standing here, listening to Amara transform Chopin's masterpiece into something transcendent, he began to question everything he'd believed about potential and possibility. Mrs. Henderson had tears streaming down her cheeks. In 20 years of teaching music to students with broken instruments and broken dreams, she'd never heard anything approaching this level of artistry. Amara was playing at conservatory level, beyond conservatory level. She was playing with the emotional depth of someone who'd lived every note, who understood that music was life translated into sound. The final section approached like an inevitable storm on the horizon. Chopin's masterpiece built toward its climactic moments where technique and emotion had to merge completely, or everything would collapse into mechanical noise. This was where piano competitions were won and lost, where years of training either paid off or revealed their inadequacy. Amara's hands began the ascent toward the piece's highest peaks, her fingers navigating passages that would challenge any professional pianist. But she approached them without fear, with the confidence of someone who'd earned the right to attempt greatness. The music swelled, filling every corner of the auditorium with sound that seemed to come from somewhere beyond the piano itself. Parents who'd come expecting amateur student performances found themselves witnessing something that belonged in concert halls. Students who'd dismissed classical music as irrelevant discovered that Chopin could speak their language of struggle and hope and determination. Amara's entire body moved with the music now. Her shoulders swayed with the melodic lines, her head tilted toward the keys as if listening to secrets only she could hear. The piano responded to her touch like a living thing, every note singing with perfect clarity and devastating power. The crescendo built relentlessly, inexorably. Crashing chords in the left hand supported soaring melodies in the right. The technical demands would have defeated most professional pianists, but Amara navigated them with the confidence of someone who'd lived inside this music for years, who understood its architecture from the inside out. Sarah Carter, the news reporter, found herself crying openly, her cameraman capturing everything with hands that trembled slightly behind his lens. This was no longer just a story about a school showcase. This was documentation of something miraculous happening in real time. And then, just before the final triumphant cascade that would bring Chopin's masterpiece to its stunning conclusion, Amara did something that stopped every heart in the auditorium. She paused. 3 seconds of absolute silence. Her hands suspended above the keys like a conductor holding an orchestra in perfect tension. The entire auditorium held its breath. Even Morrison froze at the podium, his mouth slightly open, his certainty crumbling in real time. In that silence, everyone understood they were witnessing something rare and precious. Something that would change how they heard music, how they saw talent, how they understood the power of human determination to transform pain into beauty. Amara's eyes opened. She looked directly at Morrison for one heartbeat that seemed to last forever. Then her hands descended for the final assault on Chopin's mountain peak. The music exploded like thunder breaking a summer sky. Every technical barrier shattered, every emotional wall crumbled. The piano sang with the voices of angels and roared with the power of storms. Amara's hands moved faster than seemed humanly possible, but every note rang true, every phrase connected to the vast architecture of Chopin's genius. The final cascade began, dozens of notes tumbling like crystal rain, building toward the piece's ultimate resolution. Amara's right hand flew up the keyboard while her left hand provided a thunderous foundation. The music filled the auditorium completely, transforming cheap seats and cracked walls into Carnegie Hall. And then, with one final chord that seemed to contain every emotion that had ever existed, it was over. Amara's hands lifted from the keys. The last note faded into silence so complete it felt sacred. For 3 eternal seconds, nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Nobody dared disturb what they'd just witnessed. Then, from the back corner, came the sound of one person clapping. The single clap echoed through the sacred silence like a gunshot. Rose Washington, oxygen mask hanging around her neck, brought her weathered hands together with deliberate strength. Once, twice, 3 times. Then Marcus Johnson stood up. The football star who'd never voluntarily listened to classical music found himself on his feet, applauding without thinking. His movement rippled through the auditorium like a wave breaking against shore. Jessica Martinez rose next, tears still streaming down her face. Then her parents. Then the couple behind them. Within seconds, the entire auditorium erupted in a thunderclap of applause that shook the old building's foundations. But it wasn't polite appreciation. This was something primal, overwhelming. Parents who'd come expecting amateur hour found themselves witnessing genius. Students who'd dismissed Amara as the quiet scholarship kid discovered they'd been sitting next to greatness all along. The standing ovation built like a storm, wave after wave of recognition washing over the stage. People weren't just clapping for technical skill. They were applauding for every assumption that had just been shattered, every prejudice that had just been exposed as hollow and stupid. At the podium, Morrison stood frozen in the chaos. His face had become a battlefield of competing emotions. The confident smirk that had started the evening was long gone, replaced by confusion that slowly morphed into something approaching recognition, then embarrassment, then grudging awe. His carefully manicured hands hung useless at his sides. For 15 years, he'd built his authority on controlling narratives, managing expectations, keeping people in their assigned places. But Amara had just detonated every assumption he'd used to justify his worldview. She stood beside the piano bench, accepting the tsunami of applause with quiet dignity. No theatrical bows, no manufactured emotion. Just a 17-year-old girl who'd spoken her truth in the only language that had ever made sense to her. Mrs. Henderson pushed through the crowd gathering near the stage, her face radiant with pride and vindication. Behind her came parents who'd never spoken to Amara before, students who'd treated her as invisible, teachers who'd underestimated her potential. "Where did you learn to play like that?" called out Dr. Patricia Williams, a parent who taught music at Wayne State University. "Who was your teacher?" Amara's voice cut through the noise with simple honesty. "I taught myself. From library books and YouTube videos." The admission sent a fresh wave of amazement through the crowd. Self-taught. No expensive lessons, no private conservatory training, just raw talent, determination, and a keyboard with broken keys. Sarah Carter, the news reporter, pushed forward with her microphone. "Amara, that was extraordinary. How does it feel to have just given what might be the performance of your life?" Amara looked past the reporter toward the podium where Morrison still stood in stunned silence. When she spoke, her words carried clearly through the auditorium's acoustics, reaching every corner with devastating clarity. "Music doesn't see color, Principal Morrison. It only recognizes the truth." The crowd fell silent again, but this time the silence hummed with electricity. 15 words that cut deeper than any accusation, more elegant than any attack. A reminder that excellence spoke louder than prejudice, that talent transcended every boundary others tried to impose. Morrison's face flushed red. His tie suddenly felt too tight. He tugged at it unconsciously while searching for words that wouldn't come. Around him, parents and faculty members who'd witnessed his orchestrated humiliation attempt now watched his public reckoning. The applause resumed, but now it carried additional weight. People weren't just celebrating Amara's performance. They were acknowledging the courage it had taken to transform potential destruction into triumph. Dr. Williams approached the stage with purpose. "Amara, I'm Patricia Williams from Wayne State's music department. We need to talk about your future. Tonight." Behind her, other figures emerged from the crowd. The scholarship representative who'd been quietly observing, a retired professor from the Detroit Symphony, a local piano teacher offered her studio for practice time. But the most meaningful moment came when Mrs. Henderson reached the stage and wrapped Amara in a fierce hug. "I'm sorry," she whispered, loud enough for nearby microphones to catch. "I should have fought harder for you. I should have made them listen." The auditorium had transformed from a venue for Morrison's controlled showcase into something resembling a celebration. Students surrounded Amara, asking questions, offering congratulations, treating her with the respect she'd always deserved. Morrison remained at the podium, no longer the center of attention in his own event. The power dynamic that had defined Riverside High for 15 years had shifted in 17 minutes of music. And everyone in that auditorium understood that nothing would ever be quite the same. The auditorium slowly emptied, but clusters of people lingered around the stage like iron filings drawn to a magnet. Amara found herself at the center of conversations that would have seemed impossible 3 hours earlier. Dr. Patricia Williams from Wayne State had claimed a corner near the piano, her business card already pressed into Amara's palm. "Full scholarship," she said, her voice urgent with possibility. "Room, board, private instruction. We can make this happen by fall semester." "But the audition," Amara began. "What we just witnessed was your audition, Doctor," Williams interrupted. "I've heard Chopin's ballad performed at Carnegie Hall." "You belong on that stage." The words hit Amara like physical blows. Belong. The same word Morrison had weaponized against her now became a bridge to everything she'd dreamed. Her grandmother's oxygen tank wheezed softly in the background as Rose navigated her wheelchair closer through the crowd. Sarah Carter finished interviewing Mrs. Henderson and approached with her cameraman trailing behind. "Amara, Channel 7 wants to feature your story on tomorrow's morning show. This performance is already going viral on social media. She showed Amara her phone screen. Videos recorded by audience members were spreading across Facebook and Twitter with captions like, "This girl just destroyed every excuse I've ever made," and "When talent meets opportunity, magic happens." Marcus Johnson, still slightly dazed from his emotional response to the music, stepped forward with uncharacteristic shyness. "Hey, I wanted to apologize for never really seeing you before tonight. That was incredible." His words opened floodgates. Students who'd treated Amara as invisible for 3 years suddenly found their voices. Jessica Martinez, her earlier cynicism completely dissolved, offered her family's piano for practice time. "My mom teaches lessons. She wants to meet you." But the most significant transformation was happening in the adults who'd witnessed Morrison's orchestrated humiliation attempt. School board member Janet Torres, who'd remained silent during budget cuts to arts programs, approached with determination written across her face. "Miss Washington, I owe you an apology, and more than that." She glanced toward Morrison, who was attempting to slip away through a side exit. "The board will be reviewing our arts funding at next week's meeting. What happened here tonight changes everything." Mrs. Henderson couldn't stop smiling through her tears. For 20 years, she'd fought to keep music alive in a system that viewed it as expendable luxury. Tonight, one student had accomplished what decades of advocacy couldn't. She'd made the case for arts education in a language everyone understood. "I have connections at the Detroit Symphony," she told Amara, her voice thick with emotion. "Master classes, performance opportunities. You won't practice on broken keyboards anymore." Mr. Miller from the corner store had somehow made his way to the auditorium after closing his shop. He stood quietly at the edge of the celebration, pride radiating from his weathered face. When Amara spotted him, she broke away from the crowd to embrace the man who'd let her practice fingering on his counter during slow afternoons. "You did it, kid," he whispered. "You really did it." But the most profound moment came when the crowd finally parted enough for Amara to reach her grandmother. Rose Washington sat in her wheelchair, oxygen mask around her neck, eyes bright with tears and vindication. "Mama would be so proud," Rose whispered as Amara knelt beside the wheelchair. "Daddy, too. They always knew you had the gift." "We did it, Grandma," Amara replied, taking the old woman's weathered hands. "We actually did it." "No, baby. You did it. I just kept the faith." The practical implications began manifesting immediately. Dr. Williams had connected with the scholarship representative, streamlining application processes that normally took months. Mrs. Henderson was already planning summer intensive programs to bridge any gaps in Amara's formal training. Local news outlets were requesting interviews. The Detroit Free Press wanted to run a feature story. A classical music blog had already posted a review calling Amara's performance the kind of discovery that reminds us why we fell in love with music in the first place. Morrison had managed his escape, but his absence spoke louder than his presence would have. The man who'd built his authority on controlling narratives had lost control completely. By tomorrow, his orchestrated humiliation would be remembered as the moment he revealed his own limitations rather than exposing Amara's. As the auditorium finally cleared, Amara found herself alone with the piano that had been her stage for transformation. She ran her fingers across the keys one more time, amazed that something so simple, 88 black and white keys, could hold such power to change lives. The scholarship was secured. Wayne State's music program awaited. Performance opportunities stretched ahead like an endless highway. But the most important victory was simpler and more profound. For the first time in 17 years, Amara Washington knew exactly where she belonged. The community center had already called, asking if she'd teach piano lessons to neighborhood children. The circle was beginning to close, talent nurturing talent, dreams inspiring dreams. Outside, Rose Washington breathed easily despite her oxygen tank. Inside, her granddaughter had claimed her rightful place in a world that had tried to make her invisible. Justice, it turned out, could be played in the key of C minor. 6 months later, Amara Washington walked across the stage at Wayne State University's Music Conservatory, her acceptance letter framed and hanging in the apartment she now shared with her grandmother, an apartment with reliable electricity and a piano that stayed in tune. But the real transformation wasn't in the scholarships or the opportunities that had flooded in after that night. It wasn't even in the way Riverside High had quietly increased arts funding, or how Morrison had transferred to a district office position where his interactions with students were limited. The real change lived in the eyes of the 12 children who gathered every Saturday at the community center, where Amara taught piano lessons on the instrument that had been donated in her honor. Kids who looked like her, who lived in apartments like the one she'd grown up in, who carried dreams that seemed too big for their circumstances. Excellence isn't about proving others wrong, Amara told them during her first lesson, her fingers finding the opening notes of Chopin's Ballade. It's about proving yourself right. When we dare to share our authentic gifts, we don't just change minds, we change hearts, communities, and futures. The video of her performance had been viewed over 2 million times. Comments poured in from around the world, people sharing their own stories of being underestimated, of finding courage to pursue dreams others had dismissed as unrealistic. But the message that mattered most came from a 9th grader at Riverside High who'd watched the performance live that night. "You showed me that. Where I come from doesn't determine where I'm going. Thank you for not staying quiet." Rose Washington kept that message taped to her oxygen concentrator, reading it whenever the medical bills threatened to steal her hope. Her granddaughter hadn't just earned a scholarship. She'd proven that talent, determination, and dignity could transform entire communities. The piano lessons had a waiting list now. Mrs. Henderson had started an after-school program that connected student musicians with community mentors. The school board had approved funding for instrument repairs and new sheet music. Most importantly, a generation of young people had learned that excellence was their birthright, regardless of what anyone else believed about their potential. What gift are you hiding because someone told you it wasn't enough? What would happen if you let it shine anyway? Every extraordinary achievement starts with someone brave enough to sit down at the piano and play their truth, even when the audience expects them to fail. If Amara's story moved you, subscribe to Black Soul Stories for more incredible tales of underdogs who changed everything with courage and talent. Next week, the janitor. Everyone ignored had a PhD. What he did next left the CEO speechless. Your next inspiration is just a click away. Hit that notification bell and join a community that believes every voice deserves to be heard. Because sometimes, the most powerful performances happen when someone tries to silence you completely.